The cold wind howling outside the laboratory window went entirely unnoticed by Dr. Marina. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing monitor illuminating her face in the darkened room. For years, she and the entire scientific community had accepted a very simple, unquestionable truth about one of the world's most beloved companions. The Labrador Retriever. Every historical record, every breeder's manual, and every textbook pointed to a single, isolated origin: the freezing, rugged coastlines of Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada. It was a perfect story. Fishermen from the North Atlantic relying on the extinct St. John's water dog, breeding a loyal, water-loving companion that would eventually conquer the world. Marina had set out merely to map this specific genetic lineage, a routine sequencing to confirm what everyone already knew. But as the data sets finally finished compiling on her screen, what she saw made her completely freeze. The genetic markers staring back at her shouldn't be there. They defied the established timeline. They contradicted the very foundation of the Labrador's official history. According to the DNA now mapped before her, the pure Canadian origin wasn't just slightly inaccurate, it was fundamentally wrong. If these sequences were correct, then the Labrador was hiding a secret that spanned centuries and crossed oceans far beyond the icy shores of North America. But this was only the beginning. The anomaly she had just uncovered would soon unravel a mystery far deeper than a simple pedigree, pointing to a forgotten network of global navigators. If you love discovering the hidden truths behind the history we thought we knew, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now to uncover this journey. Returning to the sterile glow of the laboratory, the crushing weight of that genetic discovery began to dismantle the classic narrative brick by brick. The official history, accepted for decades as an unshakable dogma, had always been told as a sort of rustic fairy tale with a distinctly aristocratic twist. Legend had it that in the early 19th century, wealthy British earls and dukes became utterly fascinated by the tireless, thick-coated, heavy-tailed black dogs that relentlessly retrieved fishing nets in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. According to the law, these noblemen imported these remarkable animals, then known as St. John's water dogs, directly to the bustling port of Poole Harbour in England. There, through a highly rigorous and refined selective breeding program, the English nobility supposedly purified the lineage. They eliminated perceived imperfections and single-handedly created the modern Labrador, saving it from what would have been an imminent extinction. However, the genetic markers glowing brightly on Marina's screen were telling a completely different and significantly older epic tale. The alleles found in the Labrador's DNA did not simply point back to North America. There were deep, undeniable, and striking genetic signatures inextricably linked to ancient European hunting dogs and primitive British retrievers. These markers predated the supposed noble discovery and importation of the dog by centuries. The genome was heavily peppered with the intrusions of continental scent-hound lineages that, according to the official timeline, simply had absolutely no business being there. Faced with this massive geographical and temporal contradiction, Marina felt a sudden, fleeting wave of relief as she formulated a hypothesis. It was an idea that seemed to tie up all the loose ends in a brilliant and logical manner. The resolution suddenly appeared obvious and elegant. She muttered quietly to herself, frantically scribbling in her worn notebook. The answer had to lie in the early colonial migration patterns. The very first British colonists and rugged sailors who began to populate and exploit Newfoundland in the 17th century would have certainly brought their own trusted hunting dogs and hounds across the ocean from Europe in their wooden ships. These European dogs would have freely intermingled with the local canine population of the island long before the aristocratic breeders of the 19th century ever got involved in the story. This would perfectly and neatly explain the presence of the primitive British markers and the ancient hound DNA. The official history wasn't entirely destroyed, she thought, with a deep sigh of satisfaction. The timeline had simply been pushed back a few centuries. The mystery seemed to be neatly solved, and the hard science was finally aligned with the historical logic of British colonization. But before Marina dives deeper to uncover the truth behind these canine ancestors, it is important to realize that the history we are taught is often just the surface of a much deeper reality. If you want to dive deeper into the hidden layers of history and master the art of uncovering the truth, there are even more advanced techniques, methods, and related insights gathered in our complete material. This comprehensive guide connects the dots between historical research and modern analytical skills, giving you the tools to see what others miss. The link is available right now in the description of this video and in the first pinned comment. Grab it today to elevate your understanding of the world, and keep watching, because the mystery Marina is about to uncover next will completely shatter everything you thought you knew. This comforting sensation of triumph lasted only until the very next morning. Driven by a surge of extreme scientific zeal and a relentless methodological perfectionism, Marina decided to run one final, exhaustive population admixture algorithm. This time, she cross-referenced the Labrador's DNA, not just with known British and North American genomes, but with an exhaustive global database. This system included biological samples from both extinct and living canine populations from across the entire European and Asian continents. She hit the execution command and walked away to grab a desperately needed cup of coffee. She was entirely confident that she would return to find nothing more than the final statistical confirmation of her English colonist theory. When she returned and glanced at the monitor, the ceramic mug nearly slipped from her trembling fingers. A completely new cluster of principal components had formed on the scatterplot. It was an isolated genetic stain that was statistically impossible to ignore or explain away. There, deeply and fundamentally rooted in the core genome of the modern Labrador retriever, was a massive, unmistakable cluster of Iberian genetic markers. These were genomic signatures intimately and undeniably associated with the ancient rustic Portuguese water dogs and the heavily built mastiffs that once accompanied the vast whaling fleets of the Basque country and northern Spain. The shock in the room was absolute. How on earth could the coastal and Mediterranean genetics of the Iberian Peninsula have infiltrated so massively and inseparably into the bloodline of a dog that supposedly evolved in the complete, freezing isolation of British Canada? The answer, Marina began to realize with a chilling wave of historiographical excitement, was not going to be found in the elegant, leather-bound journals of English lords. It was hidden in the ruthless, bloody, and entirely forgotten maritime routes of the North Atlantic. The island of Newfoundland between the 16th and 18th centuries was not some peaceful, isolated English colonial settlement cut off from the rest of the civilized world. It was, in reality, the most chaotic, brutal, and cosmopolitan maritime frontier on the face of the earth. The Grand Banks, a colossal international hub where massive fleets of Basque whaling ships, heavy Portuguese galleons, agile French schooners, and British vessels all converged. Every single one of them was driven by the exact same insatiable pursuit of the ocean's boundless wealth. And on those ships, crossing treacherous oceans under unimaginable conditions, it wasn't just men hardened by sea salt and freezing winds who were making the journey. They were bringing with them a veritable multinational canine workforce. The mystery that Marina thought she had neatly closed had just blown wide open. It was connecting the most docile dog sitting in modern family living rooms to the most dangerous and forgotten commercial routes in the entire history of global navigation. The glow of the computer monitor was now the only source of light in the entire laboratory, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls as Dr. Marina relentlessly pulled up one historical database after another. The genetic revelation of the Iberian markers had completely shattered the neat, orderly timeline of the Labrador retriever, forcing her to abandon the biology archives and dive headfirst into the chaotic, fragmented world of 16th century maritime history. She began to overlay her complex genetic scatterplots with digitized, centuries-old nautical charts, tracing the perilous routes of the early European fishing fleets. What emerged on her screen was not a map of canine breeding, but a map of human survival, ambition, and global expansion. The Grand Banks of Newfoundland, a massive underwater plateau stretching out into the unforgiving North Atlantic, was the stage for this forgotten biological forge. To the modern observer, Newfoundland seems like a remote, sparsely populated edge of the world. But Marina's cross-reference data revealed that 400 years ago, it was the bustling, lawless, and freezing epicenter of a global gold rush. Except the gold wasn't pulled from the earth. It was pulled from the freezing, violently churning sea. Every single spring, as the treacherous sea ice finally began to fracture and retreat, an armada of wooden vessels would arrive from the Old World. Massive Basque galleons, specifically reinforced to hunt the leviathans of the deep, rode the swells alongside nimble French schooners and the legendary Portuguese White Fleet. an assembly of ships entirely dedicated to the pursuit of cod. And as Marina zoomed in on the scanned, handwritten manifests of these ancient vessels, she found the definitive proof she was looking for. These hardened, weather-beaten sailors did not travel alone. They brought their dogs. The Basque whalers and Portuguese fishermen relied heavily on their traditional water dogs, robust, heavily muscled animals with dense, tightly curled, waterproof coats. These dogs were not pampered pets. They were essential, highly skilled members of the crew. They were trained to dive into the freezing, turbulent ocean to retrieve lost fishing gear, to herd schools of cod into waiting nets, and to carry vital messages attached to their collars between ships navigating the blinding fogs of the North Atlantic. They possessed an incredible tolerance for freezing water and an innate, powerful drive to retrieve objects from the sea. When these diverse European fleets anchored in the sheltered coves of Newfoundland to salt and dry their massive catches, they established temporary, chaotic seasonal settlements on the rocky shores. In these isolated encampments, a silent, unintended biological exchange began to take place. The heavy aquatic Iberian dogs jumped ship and mingled freely on the pebble beaches with the agile hunting hounds brought over by early British settlers and with the sharp-nosed pointers accompanying the French crews. Before we follow Marina as she uncovers the specific, legendary physical traits that emerged from this unprecedented genetic melting pot, it is essential to understand that piecing together the hidden fragments of our past requires an investigative mindset. If you are captivated by how deeply interconnected our world truly is, the comprehensive guide linked below is exactly what you need. This premium material offers 4 specific benefits. First, it teaches you how to effectively cross-reference contradictory data. Second, it provides frameworks for analyzing complex historical patterns. Third, it helps you apply investigative thinking to solve modern problems. And fourth, it builds your capacity to understand the massive, unseen systems that shape our reality. You can find the link to this complete material in the description of this video and in the first pinned comment. Click it now to elevate your analytical skills and expand your understanding of the world. As Marina synthesized the historical records with the DNA sequences, the true magnitude of what she was witnessing became clear. The Labrador Retriever was not carefully designed in a manicured English country estate. It was forged in the crucible of the freezing Atlantic. Nature and the incredibly harsh environment of the Canadian coast acted as the ultimate unforgiving selectors. In this brutal maritime landscape, a dog that hesitated to jump into icy water, or a dog with a coat that couldn't repel the freezing sea spray, simply did not survive. The sailors needed dogs that were strong enough to swim against powerful rip currents, yet gentle enough to retrieve a fish without crushing it. This specific necessity birthed the famous soft mouth of the Labrador, a trait long attributed to the refined breeding of British aristocrats, but which Marina's data now proved was developed centuries earlier by working-class fishermen trying to save their precious catch. Over generations, the continuous blending of these European working breeds created a highly specialized, localized land race. This was the true origin of the legendary St. John's water dog. It was a biological mosaic built from the best aquatic genetics that maritime Europe had to offer. The physical traits that define the modern Labrador were survival mechanisms sculpted by the sea itself. The dense, double coat that sheds water like a duck's feathers was an inheritance from the Iberian water dogs. The thick, powerful otter tail, which the breed uses as a highly efficient rudder, was the result of generations of navigating treacherous coastal swells. The aristocratic British breeders of the 19th century, who for so long took absolute credit for creating the breed, had merely discovered a finished masterpiece. They took a working-class hero of the seas, standardized its appearance, and claimed the copyright. Marina leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the profound human history woven into the dog's DNA. The mystery of the Labrador's origin had been completely rewritten. But as she scrolled down to the final section of her genetic analysis, focusing specifically on the alleles responsible for the breed's extraordinary psychological profile, their unparalleled obsessive willingness to cooperate with humans, her eyes widened in shock. The genetic breadcrumbs for this specific behavioral trait didn't trace back to the fishing fleets of Europe. They pointed to something much older, a behavioral signature that predated the wooden ships, the Basque whalers, and even the concept of maritime exploration itself. The soft, blue light of the laboratory monitor reflected in Marina's wide, disbelieving eyes. For the past several weeks, she had meticulously dismantled the geographical history of the Labrador Retriever, tracking its physical traits across the treacherous waves of the North Atlantic, and tracing its lineage to the ancient maritime fleets of Europe. She had proven that their water-resistant coats and powerful rudder-like tails were the resulting inheritance of Iberian water dogs and hardy European hounds mingling on the freezing shores of the Grand Banks. But physical traits were only half of the equation. What truly makes a Labrador the most beloved dog on the planet is not just its physical resilience, it is its mind. It is that legendary, almost obsessive willingness to cooperate, the gentle mouth that can hold an egg without breaking it, and the unwavering loyalty to its human counterpart. This psychological profile, often referred to by breeders as the will to please, was universally credited to the highly selective breeding programs of the 19th century English aristocracy. The official narrative dictated that these wealthy noblemen had taken a rough working dog, and through decades of careful curation, instilled it with a gentle, cooperative nobility. Marina initiated a deep dive sequence on the specific alleles associated with these cooperative behavioral traits, expecting the algorithm to finally validate the British aristocrat's claims. Instead, the historical timeline on her screen began to rewind violently. The genetic breadcrumbs did not stop in the manicured estates of 19th century England. They bypassed the muddy, chaotic fishing settlements of 17th century Newfoundland. They pushed past the Basque whalers, past the medieval European hunting lodges, and continued plunging backward into the murky depths of human prehistory. The software was matching the Labrador's core psychological markers with ancient canine DNA extracted from archaeological sites dating back tens of thousands of years. The results were matching the remains of the very first domesticated dogs that had hunted alongside early humans across the Eurasian steppes. The realization washed over her, completely and utterly destroying the single origin hypothesis once and for all. The British nobility had invented absolutely nothing. The rugged fishermen of Newfoundland hadn't created the retrieving instinct either. The Labrador's defining psychological characteristics were not the product of modern selective breeding. They were the surviving, untouched echoes of the original primordial pact forged between early humans and wolves. That intense desire to cooperate, to read human cues, and to retrieve without consuming the prey. These were the exact survival traits selected by our hunter-gatherer ancestors at the very dawn of domestication. The aristocratic breeders of the Victorian era had simply taken a genetic legacy that had been freely roaming the earth for millennia, fenced it in with a pedigree registry, and claimed they had invented it. They hadn't created a new breed. They had merely put a copyright on a prehistoric blueprint. As Marina uncovers this incredible truth about the ancient unbroken bond between humans and dogs, it forces us to rethink everything we know about our closest companions. If this deep dive into the hidden history of the Labrador is changing the way you look at your own dog, take a brief moment right now to subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and tell us in the comments below what kind of dog you have at home. Your engagement helps us continue investigating and bringing these profound historical mysteries to light. Marina leaned closer to the screen, her mind racing as she recontextualized the entire epic journey of these animals. The isolated, freezing environment of Newfoundland wasn't the birthplace of the breed. It was a brutal, unforgiving evolutionary crucible. When those diverse European working dogs arrived in the North Atlantic centuries ago, the lethal cold and the punishing labor acted as a massive genetic filter. Any recent, softer genetic mutations were ruthlessly stripped away by the harsh environment. Only the strongest, most ancient cooperative survival traits were allowed to persist. The dogs that thrived in those icy waters were the ones that reverted to their most essential, primordial programming. The legendary St. John's water dog was essentially a bottleneck, a localized concentration of a universal prehistoric cooperative gene scattered across Europe and brought together by the chaos of global maritime trade. The sheer magnitude of this plot twist was staggering. The modern Labrador Retriever, long heralded as the ultimate symbol of purebred refinement and isolated Canadian heritage, was actually the exact opposite. It was the ultimate globalized mosaic. It was a living archive of human exploration, carrying the blood of Spanish mastiffs, Portuguese water dogs, and ancient British hounds, all held together by a psychological framework built by prehistoric hunter-gatherers. The history books had presented the breed as a neatly packaged product of modern human ingenuity. But the DNA revealed that the Labrador was much more than a breed. It was a mirror reflecting thousands of years of survival, collaboration, and our relentless drive to conquer the unknown alongside our oldest biological allies. The pale glow of the laboratory monitors now felt entirely different to Marina. It was no longer the sterile illumination of modern data processing, but the warm, flickering light of a prehistoric campfire. The genetic sequences cascading across her screen had taken her far beyond the freezing shores of the North Atlantic and the manicured estates of 19th-century British nobility. The psychological profile of the Labrador Retriever, that legendary willingness to cooperate with humans, was not a modern invention. It was a perfectly preserved artifact from the dawn of domestication. The algorithm had traced the specific alleles responsible for their gentle mouth and intense loyalty right back to the earliest known canine remains found alongside hunter-gatherers on the ancient Eurasian steppes. This was the definitive destruction of the single origin hypothesis. The British aristocrats had absolutely nothing to do with the creation of the Labrador's mind. The rugged fishermen of Newfoundland had not engineered their retrieving instincts either. They had all simply been fortunate enough to interact with a surviving echo of the original pact forged between early humans and wolves. Marina sat back, letting the magnitude of this historical reinterpretation wash over her. The isolated, lethal environment of the Canadian Grand Banks was not a birthplace. It was a brutal, unforgiving evolutionary filter. When the diverse, multinational canine workforce arrived on the ships of Basque whalers, Portuguese fishermen, and French explorers, the punishing cold and the perilous labor of the ocean acted as a massive genetic crucible. In that icy expanse, any recent softer biological mutations were ruthlessly stripped away by the harsh realities of survival. Only the strongest cooperative traits were allowed to persist. The dogs that thrived in the freezing waters of Newfoundland were the ones that reverted to their most essential, primordial programming. They had to rely entirely on their human counterparts, reading subtle cues amidst blinding fogs and raging storms. The environment had forced the animal back to its absolute biological baseline. This meant that the legendary St. John's water dog was essentially a genetic bottleneck. It was a highly localized concentration of a universal, prehistoric cooperative gene that had been scattered across Europe for millennia, only to be brought back together by the chaotic, globalized machinery of early maritime trade. The history books had presented the Labrador Retriever as a neatly packaged product of modern human ingenuity, a triumph of Victorian selective breeding. But the DNA revealed a truth that was infinitely more complex. The Labrador was the ultimate globalized mosaic. It was a living, breathing archive of human exploration and endurance. Within its bloodline, it carried the thick, water-resistant coats of Spanish Mastiffs and Iberian water dogs, the agility of ancient British hunting hounds, and the indestructible psychological framework built by our prehistoric ancestors. The breeders who claimed to have invented the breed had merely discovered a finished masterpiece that had been sculpted by the ocean and tempered by thousands of years of human struggle. They took a rugged, working-class hero of the seas, standardized its physical appearance, gave it a pedigree registry, and claimed the historical copyright. But every time a modern Labrador dives into a lake to retrieve a thrown stick or gently carries a fragile object in its mouth, it is not demonstrating a trait learned in an English kennel. It is echoing the survival mechanisms of a 16th-century Portuguese sailor trying to haul a heavy cod net through freezing surf. It is vibrating with the ancient instincts of a prehistoric hunter relying on a tamed wolf to survive a brutal winter. The dog is a living map of our own global navigation, a biological testament to centuries of relentless human contact across continents and oceans. Our canine companions are not just pets. They are the oldest biological allies we have in our ongoing journey to conquer the unknown. They hold the memories of our forgotten voyages and the silent histories of the working people who built the modern world. If this deep investigation into the hidden genetic history of the Labrador has fundamentally changed the way you look at the dog sleeping at your feet, and if you believe that understanding our past is the key to understanding ourselves, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with anyone who loves uncovering the truth. The history we accept is rarely the whole truth, and the Labrador is the ultimate proof that sometimes the greatest mysteries of human civilization are sitting right beside us, waiting to be uncovered. waiting to be understood.